In the book of Genesis, we read of a couple who couldn't have children of their own yet, but they were impatient. So instead of believing God to fulfill his promise, they took matters into their own hands and brought a child into existence through means of their choosing. We all know the story of Abraham, Hagar, and their son Ishmael, as we all know that both mother and child suffered as a result of that decision. And the more things change, the more they stay the same. It turns out that mothers and children today are falling victim to a very similar practice. I'm Shane Morris, and joining me today on the BreakPoint podcast is one of my fellow BreakPoint writers who also reports for World. Maria Baer has taken a special interest lately in the practice of surrogacy, of taking matters into our own hands in a scientific sense and bringing babies into existence through the hiring of a third party. Maria, welcome to the BreakPoint podcast.
Hey, Shane. Thanks for having me.
For those who may not know, explain for us the practice of surrogacy. How does it work and why do people engage in it?
Sure. So there are really two ways that surrogacy happens. There's the commercial way, and then there's sort of like through a personal relationship, it can happen. Both ways are fairly common. I think the personal relationship way is more common in the United States, but essentially the way it works is typically when a couple is infertile, so they're unable to have children of their own, they will hire a woman to carry a baby for them. And usually what happens at that point is the father in the couple will give a sample of his sperm, and then the mother, if she's able, will give her egg. If she can't, then usually they'll use a donor egg. It's very, very rare they would use the egg of a woman who is going to be the surrogate mother. And that, from what I understand, the reasoning behind that is because when the egg of the surrogate mother is used, it makes it legally complicated because the woman then has more rights over the child with it being her own egg. It's just weird even to have a conversation around that. So usually it's a donor egg and then donor sperm from the couple that's trying to get pregnant. The egg would be fertilized in a laboratory setting and then would be implanted into the surrogate mother. She would then carry the child for 9 or 10 months, give birth, and then the child would be in the custody of the parents who hired her. So in a commercial sense, there would be an agency involved. The couple might not know the woman. The couple would then go through an agency that would hire her. In a personal relationship sense, it usually would be a couple who maybe knows a woman, a sister, or somebody who's willing to be a surrogate mom. There would still be lawyers and a court involved and obviously medical doctors and all that kind of thing, but it's a little bit different than going through an agency. So that's kind of the two ways it happens.
Okay. Maria, there was a disturbing video that came out last month from Ukraine. It was 50 babies in row upon row of tiny bassinets or beds in a facility in Kiev under lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic. And the video's purpose was to let all the customers of this company, Biotexcom it's called, know that their babies are well cared for while they can't come and collect them. But of course, I guess the producers of the video were a little bit tone deaf to the fact that this was incredibly creepy and dystopian sounding, and just the translation and everything, it just struck you as wrong. It struck you as a baby farm. And we'll link to that in our show notes for people to watch. Maria, tell us about that, and why did this immediately grab your interest?
Well, that kept me up at night for all the reasons you're saying. It was very creepy to watch. And now we know there's upwards of 100 babies now in Biotexcom's custody. I've been sort of tracking the story along with them. Yeah, and I think there might be some things lost in translation with them as well, because I interviewed them, the owner of this clinic, and I think he didn't quite understand where I was coming from either, because they continue to email me. I got an email from them yesterday saying, one of our couples is going to come meet their babies for the first time. Do you want to come take pictures? Because it's going to be great. And I don't doubt that that's going to be beautiful, but there's a lot that they don't understand. So the video caught my attention as it did yours because, like you said, it's just rows of babies. And the babies were all screaming, which, as you know, as a father of young children, that's what newborn babies do. So that's not necessarily bad. But when a newborn is screaming, that means they need something. And usually what they need is their mom. And in the case of this video, their mom was not there, has no rights to those babies. And they had, I think in this video, they were saying, you know, at that point there were 50 babies and there were like 4 nurses that were working a shift. And so the level of physical contact, eye contact, emotional bonding that's able to take place between 4 nurses and 50 babies is very low. And that's precisely what babies need at that point in their life. I have 2 young children of my own. And I remember vividly that feeling of when they're newborns and they're crying and my body and mind just knows that they need me, right? They need something. They need to be held. They need food. They need comfort. And to watch this video and know that that's what those babies are asking for and they're not going to get it was just extremely gutting. It was really hard to see.
As you mentioned, you had a conversation with Albert Tochalovsky, who actually owns Biotexcom. And this was through a translator. So, as you said, it was difficult to kind of break the language barrier there. But I listened to that on the sections that you aired on the world and everything in it. What was your impression coming out of that conversation? What did you gather about this company and what their response to, the implicit objections is?
Right. Well, they clearly view this 100% as a business, and in such a way that he was not able to understand. For example, one of the questions I asked him, and we aired his answer in the podcast, was, have you considered reaching out to the surrogate mothers for help? Because you're clearly underwater with all these children. And he was so confused by that question. It took him a while to figure out exactly what I was asking. And I understand that. I suppose from a legal perspective, it would be really risky, I guess, for them to reach out to surrogate mothers. But it became clear to me that they're so entrenched in thinking of this as just a business. They provide a service. They provide products that people come and buy. That talking about it in any sort of ethical language was very confusing. And he was just sort of, again, I don't know how much is lost in translation. I have traveled to Ukraine a couple of times myself, and there's a lot of cultural difference there. But I just felt such a lack of urgency on his part. And I don't know if that was something that was just in the language barrier or if there was something more to that. But my suspicion is there's something more to it. He was just like, we hope that the parents can get here soon, and, are sort of blaming the Ukrainian government for not letting them in. There was just a lack of concern for the babies themselves. Like, this is such an emergency for them. It's like every day that goes by for a newborn baby who's not getting what they need, that emotional bonding, eye contact, their mother, that is potential harm later in life and lasting harm. So this really was an emergency, and it just didn't feel like they were treating it that way.
It seemed like there was a certitude to the severing of the relationship between the surrogate mother and the child, though. It was even through the translator, you could hear the no, absolutely not. We would never invite a surrogate mother in to, help care for this baby and give him or her the love and attention and closeness that a newborn needs.
Right, which was bizarre because, again, they were affirming that the babies needed something. Like, we're in dire straits. We need help from the government to get these adoptive parents in here. You have the women right there. You know who they are. They live in your country. There's no quarantine requirements for them. But again, obviously for legal concerns and otherwise. They
said they might develop emotions toward the baby.
Emotions toward the baby. The translator said. They translated it. Yeah.
Wow.
Which again struck me because, first of all, that's exactly what the babies need is emotions towards them from their mothers. And that's also what those mothers need. And this was something that I learned from Jennifer Lahl, who I interviewed for that story as well, from the Center for Bioethics, and something that I just know myself as a mother of two babies, that it's trauma for those women as well to not be able to be with those babies. Even if they signed up for it, even if they knew what was coming, chances are a lot of these women have already done this before. And that's another problem with commercial surrogacy especially, is that it tends to attract lower income women who are doing this out of a financial need, which may cause them to overlook some of these more ethical, these things of more ethical importance or their own emotional needs even. If they have 5 children at home that they're trying to provide for, and this seems like an easy way to get a lot of money, they'll do it, even though they don't get a lot of money. So yeah, it was hard from that perspective too, because I'm sure on some level, even if it's just biologically, those women want to be with those babies too, and they can't.
And many of these women are doing this again and again and again. I mean, their life looks like being continually pregnant, in essence, and then giving away their babies to other people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I found too within commercial surrogacy, even in the United States. There have been problems with agencies being willing to get a woman pregnant really quickly after giving birth, like much more quickly than would be safe. So like 2 months or something like that, which even OBGYNs just generally tell women to wait much longer than that, just in terms of family spacing and that sort of thing. But your body, there's so much recovery that needs to happen there and that kind of thing. But because of the financial incentives, and again, because it tends to attract, understandably, women of lower income, there's a lot of incentive on the other side to do it more quickly and to do it more often. And that's just really unsafe.
Some of these children are, you mentioned, being abandoned because of disabilities and so forth. And not only does that leave them parentless, but it actually leaves them stateless at that point.
Yeah, this was a crazy thing I learned through doing this story that I just hadn't thought of and didn't know about before. But I found a story of a little girl actually who was born at Biotexcom, so the same clinic I was interviewing. She was born last summer, and she was one of a set of twins. So there were 2 children born, and these were to American adoptive parents. So it was the Americans who had given their DNA for these babies, and the surrogate mother was pregnant with twins. The twins were born, and one of the twins had special needs, and it was this girl. Well, the American adoptive parents came and refused to take the girl home. They took the boy, but they refused to take the girl, and they went back. So what happens in that case is, because the surrogate mother in Ukraine has signed away her rights to those children even before they're born, she's not considered their mom, so they're not considered Ukrainian citizens. Well, once the babies are born and the adoptive parents get to Ukraine, they have to take those children to the embassy there, or to the consulate, I believe, and get their documents to bring them home. So to get them their passports, to get them their citizenship, their American citizenship. Well, since they didn't do that with this little girl, she was neither a Ukrainian citizen nor an American citizen. So she couldn't really leave, from what I understand, couldn't really leave the Biotexcom's custody because she's stateless. She's not a Ukrainian citizen. So at the time of this story that I saw, which again ran last summer, she was 3. She had been living in sort of like a de facto orphanage inside Biotexcom's custody for 3 years. A nurse was caring for her who works for Biotexcom. They were trying to navigate a way to make her eligible for adoption within Ukraine, but it still hadn't happened. And yeah, that was another thing I was concerned about with this video you mentioned, Shane, because again, like I said, the longer babies go without having the bonding and the physical nurture and all of that stuff that they need when they're born, the more likely it is that they will develop either learning disabilities, emotional disabilities, or delays, that sort of thing. And so there is definitely a concern that parents could show up whenever they can get there and say, you know, this baby's not making eye contact, that this seems like there's something wrong. And the door is wide open for them then to say, you know what, I don't want to bring this baby home. And then you have orphanages, you know, that are going to be full.
Over the past couple of months, the Colson Center and BreakPoint have pivoted to offer even more equipping content to help listeners like you respond to and make sense of the world. From our online event Truth, Love, Together to free webinars with cultural experts like Ed Stetzer and Andy Crouch. We hope you've been encouraged by these resources. If you'd like to show your support, please make a fiscal year-end gift before June 30th. You can do that at breakpoint.org/equipping. My guest today is world correspondent Maria Baer, and we're talking about the subject of surrogacy, especially as it relates to the international coronavirus crisis and what happens to children in the international surrogacy market, if I could put it that way, during times of crisis like this. And this is sort of the contingencies that emerge out of the way the structure is set up. But let's talk about surrogacy itself as an idea, as a practice, particularly as it's practiced here in the United States domestically. You recently helped write a couple of BreakPoint commentaries, one on CNN's Anderson Cooper, who announced that he and his male partner had just given birth, quote unquote, to a baby through surrogacy. And we got some pushback on that commentary. Let me summarize what I think the best meaning pro-surrogacy argument that we got here is. You have an infertile couple. Many of our listeners are willing to grant that, okay, you know, a gay couple should not be conceiving children because we don't believe that marriage is a man and a man. It's a man and a woman. But a couple is infertile, say, wants biological children, and employs a surrogate or maybe even a relative to be a surrogate to help them fulfill that dream. What's wrong with this? Why do we have this objection? Are we just being sticks in the mud about this?
Well, yes, but for good reason. No, I think what you've summed up there, and I don't want to be trite, but what you've summed up there, the argument you've summed up there is this really hurts. This is really painful. It's excruciating to find out that you can't have children. And I want to leave space for that. That's true. That would be absolutely excruciating. And I don't want to gloss over that at all. And I understand the impulse there that if you were told there's a way to get around this, there's a way for you still to have children. I completely understand the emotional pull towards that sort of answer. But that doesn't change the reality of what surrogacy is. And so if we want to have a philosophical argument, the discussion about pain has to be set aside for the moment. What surrogacy does, and we talked about this in our BreakPoint commentaries, essentially it creates a fracture. So when a baby is born, there's one thing that baby knows that it does not need to be taught, and that is its mother. Babies know what their mother smells like. There have been so many studies on this. Babies can recognize their own mother's breast milk as opposed to anyone else's. They recognize their heartbeat. They recognize their sound, the sound of their voice. They've been hearing that for months and months. And so what surrogacy does is it knowingly creates this fracture where we say, this woman is going to carry this baby. This woman is going to be all this baby knows. And then as soon as that baby is born, we're going to sever that relationship. And regardless of whether they share DNA or whatever it is, that baby knows that woman as its mom because she carried him. So to sever that relationship at all is really violent. We used the term violence, and I really think that's what it is. It is violent to take a child from his or her mom. No matter how good the intentions are behind it, even if the woman carrying the child was perfectly willing, went in with eyes wide open, which I think is another thing worth talking about because we know so little about the long-term, especially effects of surrogacy on both children and mothers, that women really can't go into it eyes wide open because we don't really know all the information there is to know. And there have been many cases where women went into it just really not understanding what it was and what their rights were. There's all kinds of documented cases of that happening here in the US. So that's a whole other thing. But let's say, for the sake of argument, she did go into it eyes wide open and the parents did as well. You're still severing that relationship and you're creating a human being by means of sort of renting it. There's a lot of similarities between it, I think, and prostitution, unfortunately, where we're looking at a woman as an object or as something. John Stonestreet put it this way, that we're looking at a woman in terms of her disparate parts, right? We would like to rent your uterus for a while. We don't want all of you. We don't want you to mother this baby. We just want this one section of you. And that's a cheap way of looking at women and a cheap way of looking at people in general. And that should matter to all of us because when we cheapen people, we cheapen ourselves. And that's really important culturally. And so that's a problem. And then you mentioned too the question of being infertile. And I'm glad you brought up the story in Genesis as well, because I've been thinking a lot about this. God knows the pain that we all go through. He knows everybody's trials, everyone's crosses that they're bearing. We have to endure pain as a result of the fall. And again, I don't mean to be trite about the pain of infertility, but God doesn't say, there's nowhere in the scripture that would say, if you have a way to get around pain, no matter what that way is, you should do it. I mean, we would scoff at that just from a philosophical perspective. And so we should be really wary of using that argument here because it's just not biblical.
It seems like so much of what we see in sexual brokenness as a whole, the sexual revolution and all its many ramifications, is that we want to take people and dice them up into little pieces and take, this piece of them or this piece of them or this piece of them. And, we see that with pornography or prostitution or, any number of other sexual pathologies. And then we also see it in reproductive pathologies and the ways we try to bring children into existence without the sexual union and the marriage that God designed that to take place in. But of course, we live in a broken world, as you said. And another objection that we often get is that, this is very similar to adoption, right? Because in adoption, a child is taken away from or is surrendered by the mother who had him or her, and those bonds are severed. And then a new family is called in to sort of fill in the gap, to sort of take over the role of the birth mom and fix the brokenness there. How do you differentiate between surrogacy and adoption?
Right. We did get that pushback a lot. And I think we got a lot of pushback as well because people felt, I heard from some adoptive moms who felt that we were really idolizing the biological relationship between a woman and the child she carries. in a way that they felt we were devaluing the relationship between an adoptive mother and their children. And that's just not the case. So the main difference between the two, between adoption and surrogacy, is that in adoption, there's a repairing happening. We all recognize that some sort of brokenness has happened. A family has been severed, either through, there's all sorts of things that can sever a family, through poverty, through sickness, through violence, whatever it might be. And adoption is a way of repairing brokenness, but it still acknowledges that something has happened that we wish wouldn't have happened, right? That wasn't the ideal for that family or for that child. But it's a beautiful way of redeeming something that's broken as a result of the fall. And in a lot of ways, it mimics God's relationship with us. Our relationship with God was broken through Adam's sin, but he redeemed that by adopting us as sons and daughters through Jesus Christ. So that's a beautiful way of looking at adoption in the physical sense here. Surrogacy creates that fracture. So surrogacy begins, the contract of surrogacy begins before the pregnancy has happened. So the baby isn't even in the mother's womb yet, and the contract is drawn up. So we are going into it knowing we're going to create a fracture. That is completely different. The ethics of that are just miles apart, where you can repair a fracture that happened through means that we maybe couldn't help, or we can create a fracture and then try to undo it somehow. And it just completely different.
Not to be too crass, but it's sort of like the difference between, finding someone on the street who's been hit by a car and getting them to a hospital, and then hitting someone with a car in order to take them to the hospital. Then
that's a good way of putting it. Of course, it's not a perfect analogy, but yeah, it's a good way. Like, you don't need to step in and cause it. Exactly.
Right. And of course, the intentions involved here are often very good, but there's, again, nothing that says in ethics or in scripture that says that if you have good intentions, you can't do bad things. Maria, there's a push now to legalize commercial surrogacy in the U.S., and it's actually gaining traction. And several efforts you mentioned in your piece, that several efforts to shut that down and to ban the practice have actually failed. So you favor banning commercial surrogacy in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it should absolutely be banned. The problem is, and I was hopeful when I started looking into this, that maybe situations like what was happening in Ukraine would sort of wake people up to the ethical quandaries of this and, the roads we could get down if we start legalizing it. But what I'm discovering, and especially when I spoke to Jennifer Law at CBC, is that states are unfortunately looking at this and saying, well, if all of this is going wrong internationally, in Ukraine, for example, then what we need to do is just regulate it. If we can pass it here and legalize it, then we can have more control over it and make sure that this sort of thing never happens. It almost never works that way, and legalizing it in that way still doesn't get rid of the real ethical concerns with the practice in general. So maybe you wouldn't end up with a situation like you did in Ukraine, although I don't know how you could avoid that because we don't know when pandemics are coming. But even if you could avoid that sort of thing, you're not going to avoid all the other ethical quandaries with surrogacy. And the problem too with commercial surrogacy, and why I was really disappointed to see like that South Dakota had shut down an effort to ban it there and that New York had legalized it. The problem is, once you commercialize it, you open the door even wider for possible exploitation of women. And this gets back to the practice attracting women who are of lower income, as a way to use their bodies or rent their bodies as a way to make money. And that, one of the issues that I've learned too in looking into this is the more medical intervention a surrogate mother requires during the pregnancy, the more the couple and or the agency or the lawyers have to pay. So it's more expensive the more medical intervention she needs. It's not difficult to picture then all of the corruption that can come through that. Let's say I'm 5 months pregnant and I call and say, hey, listen, I feel like I'm having a heart arrhythmia, or I'm feeling this symptom or whatever. They're disincentivized, my lawyer, the agency, the couple, they're disincentivized from saying, you should go get that checked out. Because as soon as I go to the doctor, that's another cost to them, okay? And I'm not saying everybody who would hire a surrogate mother would do that, but it opens the door wide open for that sort of thing to happen, and that's really dangerous. Surrogate pregnancies are inherently higher risk. There's a much higher risk of preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, and that can cause long-term health issues. Some women have had to actually take anti-rejection medications because like when you get an organ donated and your body recognizes that it's not your DNA, that sort of thing. And sometimes your body goes into attack mode. There is some research to suggest that that can happen with surrogate pregnancies. So you're putting women in a dangerous situation and then disincentivizing them from getting medical help. And that's just a recipe for disaster.
What do you say to someone who's listening to this and either has been considering surrogacy or who knows someone who is considering entering into that contract on either side, either as a surrogate mother or as someone who's hiring a surrogate mother? How would you talk to that person?
I think the first thing I would say is, again, we need to leave space for the pain involved in this. No one approaches surrogacy lightly. And so whether someone is considering becoming a surrogate mother, I think you can approach that from a spirit of complete generosity and kindness. I have people in my own life who have done that, and I feel certain that they did it from a place of, wanting to help others. And I want to leave space for that. I think that's totally possible for that to be the case. And in the case of families who would be approaching it as a way to bear children, I think they could approach it from a completely sort of a place of hopelessness. They might have zero intention of doing anybody any harm or of exploiting women or of anything like that. This is from a place of genuine hope for their own children. There can be, again, good intentions on both sides of this. The problem is it's just not right. I liken this, in some ways I think of a lot of the discussions we have around homosexuality, where a person, and I believe, because I think we need to take people at their word. So a person can truly feel sexually attracted to the same gender, and they can feel lonely without that sort of companionship. These are all real, true emotions that people have. Because those emotions are real and are difficult, that does not negate the fact that God has designed sexuality and our bodies in a certain way, and that when we pursue a path that's different from that way, it will cause us harm. Even if we don't think so, or even if we don't feel it in the moment, it will. And that comes from a place of trusting that what God has asked us to do is not arbitrary. It is truly for our good and for the good of our neighbors. And we know that children, and we touched on this a little bit with the fact that surrogacy sort of treats women as objects and as a sum of disparate parts. It also treats children as objects. And again, even I'm not discounting the pain of not being able to bear your own children, but children are not products. They're not something that if we can't get it this way, then I'll just try and get it this way. They're not something we should go and buy. And I think there's a spirit of that within the surrogacy movement, maybe not within each individual couple that's approaching it, but the idea behind it. And I think of Anderson Cooper's situation, especially, in which he's purposely chosen a union that he knew going in would not produce children, but he still considers himself to have a right to children. That's not what children are for. That's not what they are. They are blessings, and I don't mean to be trite, but miracles. They're something that we don't really have control over, that God gives us when he wills. And we shouldn't be messing around with that. That's not the way we are to approach children and procreation.
And you and I both know that as parents, and of course, many of our listeners, and I would include myself in that number, know that adoption is powerful. My dad was adopted. That's a part of our family story. That's part of the tapestry that God has woven through love, through the desire of couples who can't have their own children to make families. But in the process of that, we should not create ruptures that didn't exist prior. My guest today has been Maria Baer, world correspondent and one of my fellow writers here at BreakPoint and the Colson Center on a tough but very vital bioethical topic. Maria, thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. Again, our fiscal year end is approaching. Recently, we received this encouraging comment from a Colson Center supporter. I do appreciate organizations like the Colson Center and many others that are in the trenches working to bring reason and respect back into the national conversation. If the Colson Center has been a blessing to you as well, please make a gift before June 30th at breakpoint.org/equipping. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.